share the American experience. So this is the presentation today. I just assume that this works, so I don't need to go up, see up. This is the motivation. Number one, we keep talking about generations, but we actually simply use American experience generation. If we know the baby boomers experience and history is very different from us, because when people came from the Second World War and they didn't really have much work and everything, they started to reproduce. And as a result, there's a period in American history where there's a baby boom that is from 46 to 64. But we didn't experience such thing. And then came the next generation that is called Generation X. Generation X said that these are the children of baby boomers, and they are striving for economic welfare. So during the 70s and 80s, we did actually have similar experience, but we need to see whether actually they are the same or not. And yeah, that's the one on the right. And in this presentation, we are going to see how actually the classification differ when we use Indonesian experience. Okay, let me just see. Yeah. And why it's important? Because generation actually will affect the economy. Literature talk about how the size of generation will be important, especially for the government and also planners. And also, not only that, but also for the marketers. For instance, if the marketing to certain group called generations of Millennial or Generation X, which actually assuming that these people or group of people will have similar behavior, and it turns out they don't. Actually, it's already misplaced the characterization of certain generation. So each generation has their own consumption, their own working ethic and savings and etc. How many times we heard people actually talk about, this new generation or the younger generation, they are quite lazy. They hop from one job to another. You heard that, yeah? They did this or they did that. Actually, so, that kind of notion is not supported by the data. That we found out, not in this one, but we found out that actually, or my colleague found out that actually, when we compare apple to apple, that is when these people, it is a little bit strange, sorry. The chair, suddenly it goes there. When we compare the so-called millennial with Generation X, for instance, when they were about the same age, their hopping job actually quite similar. It's not significantly different. So that's why we try to look at that. Okay, the objective. Number one is to define generation based on Indonesian experience, and second, to show or investigate the effect of generation on several aspects. Today we are going to focus mostly on the first one. Oh, I should have opened this with a thank you for the Bay Institute, because this research actually was funded by Bay Institute through their research grant. And it's part of a much bigger research, and we only present the first part. Theoretical background, for those who learn economics, we are perhaps familiar with Sam Wilson consumption loan model and also Diamond, and then they started the new approach that is called overlapping generations. And then later on, because most of these are economists, some economists who also learn demography started to produce more realistically, more demographically realistic model for overlapping generation, among other Lee in 1994. After that, there are several work on this. And the second body of literature is literature on age, period, and cohort. Usually, we simply look at one phenomena comparing period, for instance, 2010 and 2020. And then we compare 2000, we look at the trend, whether during that period the trend is going up or going down. Or sometimes we look at we so-called generation, but we only look at certain period. For instance, comparing that generation in 2019, those who are aged, say 15 to 30, compare that to those who are aged 35 to 45. This practice is actually a little bit incorrect, because we only look, if we are looking at one period, it means that we only look at age effect. Because apart from the period effect, comparing 2015 and 2020, there is also age effect. Age effect means when you were young, the previous speaker talked, oh, they were young, they didn't have much money. It's different from when you were middle age, say age 40 or 45, because your life course is different. So that's what's called age effect. And then there is another one that is called cohort effect. Cohort effect is when you are similar age, say age 25, in 2020 might be different from age 25 in 2005, or age 25 in 1990, or even if we take back all the way in the 60s. I mean, I'm now half century age, and I grew up in the 70s. The experience is very different from those who grew up in the 90s or in 2000-ish. That's why it's very important to look at that. Okay, the data that we are using is actually Susanas and Sakarnas, and we divide it into three. Number one is economic, and then number two is demographic, number three is the social and education. We use 10 variables to actually try to quantify. So we don't want to accept generation just like that. We want to quantify, is there any really pattern that we can differentiate one cohort to another and we put into one generation. And this is the method. The method, this is only simple that we put here, but actually more elaborate. First, we regress every variable, that 10 variables, against age and cohort. And then when we use several distance measures, basically mathematical distance measures. Okay, I will give to Diana to explain the next graph.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here today. The graph that we are looking at now shows one of our 10 variables. So we did this for all of them. And we see that different colors represent different cohorts. In here we present only cohorts by 5 years, but we considered every single cohort. People born in 1960, 1961, 62, and so on. And we see that due to the survey that was available from 2000 to 2018, not every cohort is represented over the whole course of their ages from young to old. So that was one of the issues. And in terms of proportion of entrepreneurs among people, we see that the shapes are sort of similar, but the percentage varies for different cohorts. And perhaps it will be surprising to you that in the past there were more entrepreneurs. We think of it as a new word, but the way it was classified in the survey, entrepreneur is somebody who works alone, not in a bigger company. So we see it as the history here as people started working in bigger enterprises, the number of these independent goes down. Older cohorts, the oldest one is represent people born in 1948, and then by 5 years, our millennials on the post-millennials are all the way in the left corner. Okay, so it seems that these profiles are similar. How do we make a break? Where do we start a new generation? And we were thinking that other than for this variable, profiles may differ in the level, so percentage in this rate can be lower or higher. They can also vary in shape. So maybe some will go up and down, and for other cohorts, they may continually rise. So in order to quantify these differences, we had to introduce some measures. And
excuse me, could you back to
Sure.
the last slide, please?
yes,
If I can read this one, is at age 25,
yes,
it's close to 20%, but then the number was only 12% who were born in 1993.
yes. So cohort 1993, when they are 25 years old, percentage that were entrepreneurs, 12% of them were entrepreneurs. But people born in 1978, when they were 25, so this is a different time period.
That period.
People of age 25, 20% of them were entrepreneurs. So we say that if we think that in a life cycle, people of age 25 should behave similarly, we see that there is a difference, and we attribute that to cohort effect. One cohort that came earlier has more entrepreneurs, more independents, and later one has fewer, so they start working.
One last question. Are you tracking the same individual persons over the years?
No, these are average, everybody of age 25. So all of you born in 1995, anybody, would represent one line here. And then, so note that when we say age 25, each of these lines represent different year. But that's when each of them were the same age. Okay, so we can see the differences in shape or in values, the levels. There is another problem. Not only that we have only certain data, but even that certain data is not available for the same ages for every cohort. So we only have partial overlaps. We have to take that into account. In this case, the middle cohorts overlap in 18 points, which is the duration of the survey. But the left, all the way on the left and the right, because they are too young, there are not enough data points. For instance, you have only 1 point, that little orange point in the left. Those are people born in 2003, because in order to be entrepreneur, according to survey, you must be at least 15 years old, and by 2018, we only have 1 point for them. Okay, so again, that was another challenge, and let's see how we did. Let A and B be two profiles. Let's say people born in 1980 and 1985. They represent two different cohorts, and they overlap in n points. So maybe we have data for n ages for both of them. So say 15 to 15 plus n. And if you're wondering if you had the slide with all formula on it, yes we do. But you see that this is very simple. A is cohort born in 1980, B is cohort born in 1985. And we see this AK minus BK squared and then sum is nothing other than this distance at age 25 squared plus this distance at age 26 squared plus this distance squared and so on. So this cumulative distance allow us to see the difference between profiles. It would be easier if you have just one value, say lifetime savings or number of children, average number of children. But because we want to look also how they behave from young to old, we have to compare many points, and that's why we introduce these measures. And you see several formulas. In the end, we decided to use Euclidean distance because it gave us the best distinguishing points. So if we do that, here is an example for one of the variables. So this is just considering one particular characteristic, percentage of entrepreneurs among people of certain age. We see that these represent the differences between cohort N and N+1. People born in 80 and 81, people born in 2000 and 2001, and so on. So you want to see, this, is there a gap? Are people born in 2000 different from people born in 2001? This is idealization. So we know that generation doesn't change on the spot. People don't just suddenly become different. But we consider these points, and then we allow for certain overlap between the generations that we define. So it is mathematical. In reality, it's not exact, but this is just a model. Okay. So in picture number 1, this is the one we use, Euclidean distance. So basically the distance between those two lines. We see that there are some peaks and there are some lower values. Peak means they're very different. People born in 80 and 81 is much more different than people born, okay, sorry, so here is people born in 70 and 71 are much more different than people born in 60 and 61. So we look where are the two consecutive cohorts most different. Are people suddenly a little bit different between those born in 80 and 81 or 85 and 96? Or was it before between people born in 65 and 66? And we find these points. Yes, a peak in distance or a dip in similarity signals that there is a change between the generations. Okay, so we identify where they might change, and then we pull all the variables together. Because variables are very different in their values, and even normalizing them would be difficult because we don't know what is small, what is high for rate of entrepreneurs. We don't know what is high or low for crimes. So we just pull out all the years in which these changes occur. And then when we sort of have a cumulative point, several changes around in the period of 5 years, we say, okay, now people have sufficiently changed that we can call them a new generation. And we, again, assume that the variables that we considered will contribute to the overall behavioral change among these people. Okay, so Turro will continue with explaining how our results correspond to Indonesian history.
So, using those mathematical model and everything, it's really interesting. This is how we came up. What does it say? That actually our history is very much influenced by our political history, isn't it? Well, if we are using bahasa Indonesia, that's the first, itu generasi, karena saya dulu pramuka ya, itu generasi Orde Lama sebelumnya itu ada generasi perjuangan gitu kan ya. Kemudian Orde Lama, kemudian Orde Baru. Nah, yang menarik, interesting point is that the millennials, so-called millennials, is actually very small. Because if we look at the break in behavior in those 10 variables that we are using, millennial only consists those who were born in the 1990 to about 2000. And then after that, post-millennial. However, those who were born in the 70s, 1970, are quite similar all the way until those who were born in 1990. Why? Because our president was still the same. During the time, president is the same. How many of you actually very familiar with this notion? Menurut petunjuk Bapak Presiden, Remember that? But not everybody would remember that because some kids actually never heard about that. Even, in fact, one of my friend's kid, age, how old, Alvin? 9, 10. One day he saw a picture and then he asked his mother, "Who is this?" His mother said, "And you don't recognize him? That's Soeharto." We can see that the size of new order generation atau Orde Baru is quite big, as is a size of old order. So those who were born in the 40s, after 40s, all the way until late 60s, basically they didn't show any change in behavior. Only when the new generation, that is the new order or Orde Baru came, that they changed. Okay, next I will just show, this is how demographer look. This yellow shows,
Excuse me.
yeah,
Could you back, please?
sure.
How do you exactly translate this color? I mean, between, yeah, I can, I mean, a part of you showing that there are such time moving over time between these different generations. What is underlying issue that you want to tell here?
That actually, first we start from assumption that there is certain behavior held by people that are born in certain cohort. And the use of generations, which basically a group of cohort, we need to see which classification actually applicable to Indonesia. We cannot simply adopt millennial, Generation X and everything, because if we see there are many talk about, oh yeah, current millennial, but that talk already lasts for almost 10 years. The millennial are the same, people aged say this and that. That's actually sometimes showing age effect, not cohort effect. This is a cohort effect, this is different. Now, I just want to show you fast, this is the size, and this is population pyramid for those who were born in 1950, only 1 year, 1950. So I follow from when they were born all the way until their age 100. Compare that with those who were born in 1970. You see how they are very different. So those, when they have these differences, what do you think happened? When people only have this many people compared to when people have this many people. So even in the same age, they have to compete more compared to when they were in the cohort of 1950s. This is cohort of 1990s, and this is the millennial. Oh, sorry, in Indonesia, I think I would call it the reformasi. So generasi reformasi. So it's not just using Indonesian term, but using Indonesian term based on our experience. And another thing that we have to remember, but why this is important, that we have to remember that at each given time, there are several generations living. And each generation, if we want to use economic term, for instance, has their own NPC, has their own time preference, has their own other characteristic. So when we actually do planning or policy action, we have to take into account this. So this is multiple generation at the same period in 2020 today. Let's see how they change. This is in 2025, move to 2030, 2035, 2040. Yeah, and this is 2050, 2045. This is 100 Indonesian. Now, if you're making, say, mathematical modeling or econometric modeling and using long-term for growth, if you don't take into account this difference, then you might be a little bit off. Just assume that everybody actually behave the same, because they don't. And as we can see, we actually, for 2045, we keep talking about 2045. What is it called? Indonesia, mass or some
Demographic dividend.
demographic dividend, totally different thing. That's actually different part of the research. But in Indonesia mass, it will consist of these generations, different of generations. Now, our next job, of course, to find exactly who they are, exactly what kind of behavior that they show. We already, so our research simply want to trigger actually the discussion that we need to talk about Indonesian generation based on our experience. We don't want to simply adopt from outside that it turns out not necessarily the same as our experience. This is comparison only. I will be fast. So we can see that between Indonesian and American generations is quite different. Although interestingly, the classification, the number of classification is not much different, 4 or 5, depending on whether you will count also the struggling atau generasi perjuangan, mereka yang lahir sebelum tahun 45 atau 47, while for American, that's those who were born before 1946. So that's, in America it's called silent generation. And this is, I believe, the last before the end. So we can see that if we, for instance, want to make a plan about 2045, and we use generation based on American generation experience, we can see it's very different. That's actually the baby boom is only 6 million in 2045, while the Orde Lama generation is still longer, that is 56 million, higher. And then in 2045, still 16 million. And Reformasi, today there are about 44 million of generasi Reformasi that's only born in 1990 to 2000. While millennial, we take a little bit higher band if we use millennial. It means that we actually overestimate whatever that we estimate for millennial. In 2045, the generasi Reformasi still 41 million, and in generasi, if we use millennial, as if it's 58. But again, this generation, millennial, X and everything is not based on our experience. And remarks. So classification generation based on experience actually resemble our political history. That is very interesting. And second, analysis using the age, period, and cohort might provide more information than simply looking at period that we usually do. That's it, our presentation. And this is working in progress, and hopefully we will publish soon this paper. Thank you.
A big applause to both of our presenters, and now we already learned a lot about information about the demographic and even the difference between the cohort and the age and the implication to the classification that made for Indonesia. Also, we also learned about the cohort impact to the entrepreneurship. I don't know exactly which cohort is more entrepreneurial than the other. Maybe there's another explanation about that. But we also understand that by having this classification which related to Indonesian specific, the government can address specific issues like, for example, the social safety nets or other facility that they can provide from the government point of view. So I think that there will be a lot of discussions, and so we will open about 3 for the first term. Ya Ibu? 2, 3. Okay, so please mention the name, even Bu Catherine sudah ngomong namanya. Bu.
Terima kasih, mohon izin tanya lagi. Saya Catherine, untuk tadi Ibu Diana ya. So the proportion of the entrepreneurship says that the number was only 12% for those who were born post-reform, or the reform era. Is the research including the startup? Because I know that the millennials and up, many were starting a company startup, and also Pak Turro tadi yang untuk generasi yang post millennial itu entering higher school ya, enrollment. Nah itu yang saya tahu sekarang kan ada lingkaran. Kursus di lingkaran itu tidak harus sekolah university segala macam, dan ada website platform yang seperti itu. Dan saya banyak juga menemukan banyak sekali founder seperti Peter Scher Wahyu atau Chef Arnold dengan Kaisang itu juga memutuskan tidak sekolah untuk achieve higher education. Apakah kriteria researchnya bagaimana? Kalau untuk Ibu Diana tadi, apakah sudah including those who are startup, reseller, dropshippers, sekarang kan banyak. Itu apakah itu termasuk entrepreneurs atau tidak di dalam researchnya? Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Yang kedua, Bu Lydia.
Saya Lydia dari Fakultas Ekonomi UI. I'm interested in the distance measure that you use. That is 1 year. A minus B, is that 1 year or several years? And in 1 year, why 1 year? Some variables that you use, such as number of children and crime, I'm not really sure that changes in terms of behavior within 1 year or even a few years. So what were the considerations? Number 2 is, in terms of the size of the population, it does seem that the last cohort is actually quite similar. Either you define it Indonesian way or American way. I don't understand the intuition behind this. Why is it relatively similar? Is it because the various variables, as we are globalizing, the world is globalizing, we adopt similar cultures, similar policies, so that's why all the variable indicators actually is becoming similar across the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Lydia. The third one.
Thank you. Very interesting and fundamental research. My name is Nika. I am from Pusat Penelitian Ekonomi LIPI. My question is related to Ibu Lydia, related about the indicators or variables that you use. Maybe because the time limitation, you don't explain much on how on why you choose those variables. Could you please elaborate more what the reasons of the choose of the variables? And then the second one is regarding the global generation classification. You said earlier about the millennial, Gen Z, or the other things. How do they classify the how do they choose the classification? Do they also use the same variables as yours, or if it is different, then why you choose the different variables? Thank you.
Thank you. So from Bu Catherine, we got a question about the startup, reseller, which is included in the entrepreneurship, also the educational preferences, and then from Ibu Lydia we got the difference between cohort, whether it's 1 year or more, and the size of population, or otherwise we are quite similar with United States. And from Pak Nika, Pak Nika is asking about the indicators and the variables, how to determine that, and then also about the global diversification between us and the global classifications, why we are different from them, and how important that of difference that we have to make for Indonesia, and maybe how to align our own classification to the global indicators.
Thank you. Even though it's addressed to Diana, but I will answer to Patrick. So the way we actually use these variables, they're all from either Susanas or Sakernas. And from Susanas is from 1995 to 2018, Sakernas is from 2000 and 2018. And the way we actually define entrepreneurship, simply those who we are using the status of employment. So status 1, status 2, 1 is work by yourself, 2 is work helped by others, by your family members, and also work with others. So it means it's simply based on that classification. Now, as the possible answer why they are going down, it's because of the formalization of Indonesian economy actually. So when we said entrepreneur, and we are using that 1, 2, and 4 status, it means that these are many. Number 1, they are in the formal sector, informal sector, and when they move to formal sector, in general they become staff member or pegawai. When they become pegawai, then they are not entrepreneur anymore. Number 2, because of the education, especially the younger generation. Before, they actually didn't go to school. Now more and go to school, so more and more people actually become pegawai. And then, startup. So startup, we didn't really look specifically on startup or not, but we simply use BPS classification for that.
I just want to mention that startup people are probably not included in this wirausaha because they work in organization with more people. So these would be more independent workers.
And then, similar to that education non-hire, we will see later what you are saying, but I have a feeling that those are newer phenomena that might not be captured by BPS data. When I open with comparing job hopping between so-called millennial and Generation X, we were using, my colleague was using IFRS. So it's more detailed, but the result actually show it's not much different. From Lydia, I will let Diana answer. Now, why those variables? Number 1, we look at the literature. Before that, I want to mention this. This, to our knowledge, is the first quantitative study or effort to define generations. Because usually when people talk about those so-called global, although I don't really agree with that, because it's simply based on American experience, and usually historians who talk like that. But historians, I'm not saying that they don't know math or statistics, but they don't really use statistics. So this is the first effort that we know, even in the literature, we try to look, how do people define generation? Mostly coming from sociology, which is okay because I'm a sociologist myself. Came from history, which is okay because part of my degree is in history. Or marketing. Yeah, because marketing, they want to create a certain group of people so they can sell to this group of people. But there is actually no scientific effort to define generations, and to the best of our knowledge, this is the first time. Even in the world, that's interestingly why nobody actually bothered to look at this, I don't know. People simply accept, oh yeah, we are millennial, oh yeah, we are Generation X, which actually is based on American experience. And last cohort similar, I answer a little bit. That's because probably we don't have too many years yet. So those who were born after 2003, we just call post-millennial. But we can also see that the so-called comparable, the reformasi generation is really only 10 years, while millennial in most classification at least 15 years. So yeah, they are similar, but still our reformasi generation is a little bit different. For whatever reason that we probably don't have time to talk here.
Okay, so I will continue answering your first question, and then I will touch up on this one for the last generation. Oh, sure. So you asked whether the distance measures were calculated in a single year. So let's go back to this picture. So our distance measures are cumulative for over all. Ideally, we would compare the whole age span, but we don't have enough data, so we compare, say, this gray cohort with the orange cohort between ages 23 and 36, because only for those ages we have data for both cohort gray and cohort orange. Those will be born in 78 and born in 83. Now, we don't compare them at a certain age. This is just an example how they differ. But we want to compare cumulatively between this point and this point, how much difference exists. We then normalize because here we have 18 points. If you have 20 points, this distance would become larger. So we then normalize it per age. So we would divide the distance accumulated between this point and this point by 18. But for cohorts that overlap only in 5 points, we would divide by 5. Okay. So this is accumulated difference over whatever course we are able to track. And you said things don't change much within a year. That's true. I mentioned at the beginning this is just idealization, just a model. And we actually are revising our paper to include certain bandwidth, so changing between generations. Even when we say generation, reformation generation, not everybody is the same. This is our average person in that generation. But maybe in the middle, people are more similar than when you have transition between the two. And we didn't have much time to be very technical, but the way we calculate the cutoff is maybe the crime change drastically at this point, and then within 1 year people started going to school more, and they started involving in agriculture much less than before. So we are looking at several different changes that occur within a short period of time, and then say enough changes have accumulated so that we can consider these people having different characteristics. And if we have still the same table, okay, so we have, for instance, characteristic of people born between 1991 and 2000. They have higher school enrollment than the previous. Of course, school enrollment always goes up. Government would like people to be more educated. But here there is, this probably corresponds to a certain reform, educational reform. So suddenly you have a lot more people enrolled in school. They also, fewer of them own house over the period that we were able to track. So in the United States also, people sometimes talk about how this millennial generation is less likely to own the house for whatever reason, we find similar thing for this generation here. So several changes have to occur for us to define a new generation, and you're right, it doesn't happen in 1 year, but this is just sort of the point that we distinguish, and we assume that there would be some overlap around those years. And then the last cohort is similar, as Turro mentioned, exactly because we are not looking at only at one point. So we don't have enough data to track many of the variables between 2003 and now. So we do assume that as things are changing faster and faster, this generation will not be all one. And perhaps the changes may be different in Indonesia and in other countries, and maybe it will be the same, as you say, world is more globalized now.
I'd like to clarify things. Is it possible that one generation can overlap or overcoming the other generation in terms of entrepreneurship? For example, there is a moment where Indonesian tends to become the PNS, and then now tends to become an entrepreneur instead of the PNS. I expect that there's something like a cut-off of that kind of, just because if you look like that, it depends on how mature you are to enter the entrepreneurship level. But if we have a cut-off, something like that, there's a tendency of the difference preference of the certain cohort to have more in entrepreneurial things. Is it possible? And the second one is that regarding your pyramid, that we can see that the last one, is it possible that we have the problem of lower growth on the generations in the youngest one? Because maybe more the millennials tends to have less children, so instead of like that, for 2024, 2045, it's become shrinking on the bottom side. Is it possible like that? The two questions.
Since we have the graph here, maybe we can start with the population pyramid. So, Indonesian government was trying very hard between 1970s and 1980s, 19 to reduce the number of kids, because at that time it was considered that it will fewer kids, more investment into kids can bring the growth. Indonesia still doesn't have the problem that Japan and some European countries have, but in this picture we see that it sort of enters a steady state, it stabilizes in terms of number of kids. So not much changes between. Oh, sorry. Actually, this is 2045. That's only 1 year. This actually only tells us that not many of them, most of them are still there. Do we have? We have this. Okay, so this generation, in fact, yeah, we don't have the number of kids. We cannot see the change in number of people born on one of these static pyramid, but it is true that in world overall it is going down, but in Indonesia it's not critical yet.
I think that we have come to the end of our seminar today, which is very good. That we found that we have a new kind of classification which different with United States, maybe about 5 to 10 years lag. But
before you close, I have one question.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, I'm very much interested. Why are you focusing on? Probably is related to my colleague said. Why are you only focusing on entrepreneurs? I mean.
We had 10 variables. We just show one graph, but we actually.
That's only also of
1 out of 10.
We had. Okay, so we had economic variables. So we considered how much, what is the labor participation rate? Is there unemployment? Percentage of entrepreneurs or single employed? Percentage of people in agricultural sector. So that can show a shift between certain kind of employments.
And
Percentage of home ownership. But we also look at the demographic variable. How does family change between this generation and that? Do people have fewer kids, and is it related because more women go to school and for a longer time? And do they then work? All these variables will affect how the generation or group of cohorts will behave. How much they will save, when they will start saving, how much they will spend on kids, and ultimately how that will affect the country growth.
Okay, one more question, please. Sure.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jay. I'm coming representing for private. I'd like to ask you about the general overview, as well as I am the common people, about the global future challenges. How do you design, plan, and control the strong support global system community among the individual as well as human development, as a civilization nationwide and as an international network perspective? And second question, how do you define the resistances among these interactive relations in general, in a short brief? And thank you, madam. Welcome to Indonesia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, medium for 5 minutes. Okay, let me answer that. In general, we do live in globalized society. However, what we sometimes forget is not everybody is actually be or contribute directly to the globalized society. For instance, in Indonesia, in statistics, we still have trade and not trade. Trade goods and non-tradable goods. In statistics, trade statistics, we have that. We have also a number of people who are actually related to non-tradable good. Non-tradable good, it means that they are not traded among countries only. So, looking at this, is that actually we try to, not really resistance, but we try to give perspective that despite of the global trend that try to make people uniform, we actually need to look at the individual country. And we have to learn from our own experience. We have to learn from our own history and use that for our policy making, so that we don't simply imitate or adopt or even be monopolized by certain way of thinking, but we actually try to create our own history and understand it differently. Okay?
Okay, thank you for that. So, as we said before, that we have differed with the United States about 5 to 10 years lag, something like that. But the most important thing that we are free from the influence of US in terms of making the classifications. So we have become more on-centric on the Indonesian history. So I think that this is the first, as claimed by the researchers also, that is the first demographic classifications that based on the Indonesian history, maybe in Indonesia, but also in the world. So we have to give a big applause for that. And then we hope that we can see you again in the next week event in Bank Indonesia Institute, and all of us are happy with having this end of brainstorming session, and we hope that we will increase the capacity of the researchers in Indonesia, also understanding more about Indonesia dynamics